years ago, I met a man who I'll call Mr. H. As a former professor of English literature, his house rivaled the libraries of some college campuses. He was an expert in the elements that make up a good story. Relatable characters, a believable context, and for the very best stories, an opening line that draws you in from the very beginning. The first time I met Mr. H, we talked about some of the best opening lines in classic literature. Lines like Charles Dickens, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." But after a few minutes of that conversation, Mr. H waved his hand and in his distinct accent said, "Oh well, none of that matters now." When I met Mr. H, he was nearing the end of his story. At 90 years old, he had just been signed on to hospice care, and I had been assigned as his chaplain. Each week when I arrived at his house, after a brief conversation about the books that he had read that week, he would hand me his Bible and say, "Here you go, tell me something that will make me feel better." As a new chaplain and recent seminary graduate, I thought that I was up to that assignment. I remember opening my Bible in our first visit to Psalm 139, which you heard read earlier. But after just a few sentences about being seen and known and loved by God, he would say, "No, no, not that. Let's start at the beginning." And he would ask me to read from the long list of laws in Deuteronomy, or the 10 Commandments, so that we could talk about how many of them he had broken throughout his life. Every week, when I visited Mr. H, I would find a stack of paperback novels on the coffee table beside his recliner. And if you looked closely, you could see a letter grade scrawled on the inside cover of each book in pencil. Most of the books received a grade of C- or D+, because Mr. H said too many people were writing about what they did not know. Mr. H was a harsh critic of stories. And unfortunately, as the end of his life drew near, he judged his own story with a similar harshness. Mr. H knew a lot about stories. He knew a lot about God's story. But he had a hard time believing that there was room in God's story for someone like him. We never made it far enough in the Old Testament to read the scripture that Betsy read so beautifully for us this morning, the story of Samuel and Eli. But I think Mr. H would have approved of that opening line and its description of both the context and the characters. Let's hear that line again. 1 Samuel chapter 3 opens with these words. "Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread." I remember hearing the story of Samuel and Eli as a child in Sunday school. Maybe you do too. I remember being fascinated by the story of a young boy hearing the voice of God audibly calling him in the night. It was a lesson about hearing God's voice and the importance of mentors and teachers like Eli who help us recognize and respond to God's voice. When I got a little older, I remember hearing the story again and being encouraged to consider how God might be calling us to respond and to serve him like Samuel. As a young person, I always pictured this story with young Samuel in his child-sized priestly robe, happily answering God's call. But these last few weeks, as I've read and reflected on these words again from 1 Samuel chapter 3, I've noticed a few things about the characters and their context that I never noticed before. The opening line tells us, "The word of the Lord was rare. Visions were not widespread." God has gone quiet. Just a few chapters earlier in the Old Testament, God has appeared in burning bushes, parted the Red Sea, rained down manna from heaven to feed his people. But now, God has gone quiet. His voice is rare. Visions are not widespread. This story takes place in the dark. We know that because we're told that the lamp of God, the light in the temple that shone from evening until morning, had not yet gone out. And so it's nighttime. And Samuel and Eli, after a long day of ministering to God's people who have come to the temple to make sacrifices and offer prayers, they find themselves preparing for sleep right beside the lamp of God and the Ark of the Covenant. In the tradition of that day, they are as close to the presence of God as you could get. People traveled great distances to be in the presence of these symbols of their faith, because they believed that just being in their presence would help them hear and see and experience God. And yet, when the voice of God shows up in that place to the people who were supposed to know him best, they were confused and they didn't recognize it. It's easy to excuse 12-year-old Samuel. He's young, it's dark, a voice is calling his name. The scripture even tells us that he did not yet know God, so of course he mistakes the voice of God for the voice of his teacher. But what about Eli? We think he's around 88 years old at this point. He's presumably spent a lot of his life in this priestly role. He's raised his sons to be priests like him. And yet it still takes him 3 tries to realize that it's the voice of the Lord calling out to young Samuel. We're told that Eli's vision has grown dim. And I don't think it's just his physical vision, but his spiritual vision as well. He doesn't even seem to recognize true faith when he sees it. Earlier in 1 Samuel, he mistakes the fervent and desperate prayers of Samuel's mother, Hannah, for drunkenness. And the 2 priestly sons that he's raised are abusing their power in terrible ways. Eli reprimands them, but he does nothing to stop them. And that's in fact the very behavior that God has shown up to address in his late night message to Samuel. We don't really know the beginning of Eli's story, the beginning of his ministry. We meet him when he's simply going through the motions of faith without truly hearing from God. And yet, I think he remembers the sound of God's voice. It takes him a few tries, yes, but eventually he realizes that it is God who is calling, and he knows exactly how Samuel should respond, saying, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." So often we think that these stories from the Old Testament have nothing to do with us. But can't you relate to Samuel and Eli? Can you see a glimpse of yourself in this story? I've never heard God's voice calling me audibly in the middle of the night, but I have heard him speak to me through a piece of music, through the beauty of his creation, through the words or actions of someone who loves me, through the kindness of strangers, through a deep sense of knowing and peace. And probably as many times as I've heard God's voice, I've missed it. Letting God's voice be drowned out by the voice of my own busyness, confusion, and worries. Or, like Samuel, mistaking the voice of God for the voice of others. Yes, it's not so hard to find ourselves in this story. And what about their context? Samuel and Eli are living in a time when the voice of the Lord feels rare. Couldn't that just as easily describe the times that we find ourselves living in? As church attendance dwindles and wars rage and political divisions run rampant, we don't have to work too hard to see that this isn't just Samuel and Eli's story, it's our story too. But this is more than just a good story with relatable characters and a context that we understand. We know that this is part of a larger story, the story of God's light breaking into the darkness. In a world like ours that so desperately needs to see that light, the light of Christ shining in the darkness, it's easy to believe that God would choose the best and the brightest characters to tell his story. And yet, woven throughout all of the scriptures we've read from our lectionary text this morning, we hear that same truth. From the Old Testament to the New Testament to the Psalms, we hear the truth that God has always used unlikely and imperfect people to tell his story. Not in spite of their humanity, but because of it. The old and tired priest with wayward sons and failing vision becomes a mentor and teacher on how to respond to God's call. The 12-year-old boy who doesn't even know God yet becomes one of his greatest prophets. The little boy with a slingshot slays a giant. The teenage unwed mother brings forth the Messiah. The baby in a manger becomes the Savior of us all. Today, if you think you don't belong in God's story, that you're too old or too young or too sinful or too weak, the Bible tells us that we are in good company. If you've ever felt like your story doesn't measure up, that God has scribbled a D+ on the cover of your book, or given up on calling your name, then I hope you will hear this good news today from God's story. God knows all about our humanity, and he has chosen to put his treasure in ordinary, fragile clay jars like us, so that the world can see his light shining through our cracks and our flaws, and know that the power does not come from us, but from God. Joining this story, joining our story with God's story, is not guaranteed to be easy. The first prophetic message that Samuel was called to deliver didn't sound like good news to Eli. The Apostle Paul knew better than most of us what it's like to suffer for the gospel. And yet he tells us that we may be afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We may be perplexed, but not driven to despair. We may be persecuted, but not forsaken. We may be struck down, but not destroyed. The psalmist reminds us today that God is acquainted with all of our ways, that all of our days are written in his book. God already knows that we will wander just as God kept calling Samuel